Welcome back to Carneades.org. Today we're going to be continuing with our series on objections to the Kalam Cosmological argument for the existence of God. This video is going to be on premise 4, or the conclusion or the fourth statement of the argument. So, if you don't remember, premise 4 is something like, since no scientific explanation in terms of physical laws can provide a causal account of the origin of the universe, the cause must be personal. Explanation is given in terms of a personal agent. In order to really understand this premise, I broke it down into a series of other premises that formulate a different argument with this conclusion. So, all things that have a cause have an explanation. We seem to use explanation and cause back and forth really fluidly in this, so this premise seems pretty important. All explanations are either scientific or personal. It is said that since no scientific explanation can be made, the cause must be personal. We seem to be assuming that there's a disjunction between either scientific or personal explanations. There's no scientific explanation of the universe. That's just the very beginning of the statement. Therefore, there must be a personal explanation of the universe, which seems to be what the statement wants to conclude. If you have a different formulation of what this conclusion might look like in premise conclusion form, please offer it to me. I would love to respond. So, what I'm going to do now is take a look at each of these premises individually and how we can object to them. So, premise number 8. All things that have a cause have an explanation. This seems, once again, like some interesting version of the causal principle or thinking about cause and effect. Here's what I would say. So, you can go the Humean route and say there's no such thing as cause and effect. So, maybe something has an explanation, but it doesn't have a cause. You can go the Bertrand Russell route. Just because causation implies explanation for the parts of the universe doesn't make it the case for the whole. If you want more information on either of those objections, you should check out my videos on Hume and Russell's original objections to the Aquinas version of the cosmological argument. You can also say that simply because there must be a metaphysical explanation doesn't mean that there needs to be an epistemological explanation. It doesn't mean that we need to be able to know what that explanation is. We'll get into that piece of the objection a little more later. For now, let's move on to premise 9. All explanations are either scientific or personal. This, to me, is clearly the biggest problem with this part of the argument. I see no way that one could offer support for this premise. We're going to go through a couple of possible iterations of what we could mean by this premise. And if you have some great argument that supports it, I would love to hear it, because I'm really confused. So, maybe we mean explanations must either come from a discipline of science or from God. This seems clearly not the case. Explanations can come from math, philosophy, art, and so on and so forth. All of which don't seem to be either science or God. They seem to be neither scientific nor personal, and so all explanations are either scientific or personal doesn't really make sense. Maybe we mean something else. Maybe we're saying explanations must either come from a causal principle or from some intentional being. We're kind of shifting into dualism, which is where I think we're going to have to go to defend this premise. But let's take a look. Since when can intentional beings break the laws of causality? Questions about libertarian view on free will, if you're curious, I have a video. Much less exist without physical form. Because for an intentional being to break those causal principles, or to exist before causation started, it would seem to have to exist without a physical form. Maybe we mean explanations must come either from the physical world or from the mental world. Here we're clearly just in dualism. We're saying this does assume dualism. The problem with this is, even if we say, okay, we're going to give you dualism, we're going to give you libertarianism in terms of free will, even if we assume all of that is the case, we still do not have any proof that those are the only substances that exist. We merely have proof that those two substances do exist. What if there's some other substance that just exists only on the other side of the universe, or only so far back in time that it, say, is the beginning of the universe, which is what we're talking about here. If that didn't make much sense, I'm going to do something of an example. So dualists claim that there are two things, the body and the mind. The body being in the physical, causal world, and the mind being something more intentional. The body may be governed by scientific laws, the mind governed by intentional rules or something like that, I think is what this premise is going for. The mind can also be something like the soul. Now, in order to get this argument off the ground, we have to have a mind that can be independent of a body, not something that we've ever seen to exist in the real world. We have to have a mind that can break causal laws. This is the piece about the libertarian view of free will. It's a little sketchy. I have a video on it if you're curious. We also need a mind that can interact with the world without physical form. Not only does this mind have to be able to be independent of a body, which is something we've never seen, but it has to be able to interact with the world in some way without a physical form. This is a lot of weird things that we're assuming about this mind, and it's unlike any other mind we've ever come to understand. Even if, however, we give all of these things to this argument, for this premise to be successful, the only two possible explanations have to be scientific or personal, have to be either mental or physical. Even if we give dualism everything it wants, that it still does not show that there's not some other substance out there, I don't know, ectoplasm, that is neither mental nor physical. It might show that both mental and physical substances exist, but it doesn't show that only mental and physical substances exist. Finally, there's no scientific explanation of the universe. I talked a little bit about the Big Bang Theory and possible other actual scientific explanations of the universe in the last video, so here I'm going to take a look at what if there is no scientific explanation of the universe that we know right now. Simply because there isn't one doesn't mean that it's impossible for there to be one. At one point, lightning, rainbows, and volcanoes, all that kind of stuff, didn't have an explanation. But now they do. They were once thought to be works of God, now they're explained by science. Even if it's impossible for us to know the scientific explanation of the universe, that doesn't mean there isn't one. Just because something is epistemically impossible doesn't mean that it's metaphysically impossible. Epistemically having to do with knowledge, metaphysically having to do with the real world. And it may be impossible to know whether the number of atoms that existed exactly 1 million years ago was even or odd, but that doesn't mean we should give up on atoms being in existence, or the number of atoms being even or odd. All it means is that it may be impossible to know something, but it may not be impossible for that thing to exist. So simply because we don't know that there's a scientific explanation of the universe doesn't mean that there is no scientific explanation of the universe. So, that was the conclusion or fourth premise of the Kalam Cosmological argument for the existence of God. In our next video, I'm going to be taking a look at some final conclusions and takeaways we can take from both versions of the cosmological argument. Watch this video and more at Carneades.org, and stay skeptical, everybody.